If you walk through any modern pharmacy in any city in the world, from New York to Buenos Aires, you will find yourself surrounded by a sensation of sterile security. White light, orderly shelves, air conditioning. It is a temple of health, and at the center of that temple, you will almost always see a logo you have known since you were a child. A simple circle, a cross, formed by 5 letters repeated horizontally and vertically. B-A-Y-E-R. For most of us, that logo is synonymous with relief. It is the aspirin you took when you had a fever. It is the syrup your mother gave you. It is German science, precise, reliable, dedicated, as their famous slogan says, to a better life. We have been taught to trust that green or blue cross. We have been conditioned to believe that what is inside those boxes has been designed exclusively for our well-being. But that trust is an illusion, a marketing facade carefully constructed over 160 years to hide a much darker reality. Because if you could scrape off the white paint from that logo, if you could look through the microscope of history, you would not see molecules of healing. You would see blood. You would see the mass addiction of millions of children. You would see experiments on human beings. And you would see the birth of the most destructive substance that has ever plagued humanity. This is not the story of a benevolent company that made some mistakes in the past. This is the chronicle of an entity that discovered very early in its history that death is a much more profitable business than life. It is the story of how a small dye workshop in the Wupper River Valley transformed into the largest legal drug trafficker in history, selling pure heroin as a cough remedy for children. Forget everything you think you know about medical ethics. We are about to enter a world where patients are not people, but customers, and where side effects do not matter, as long as the profits keep flowing. Welcome to the true story of Bayer. Welcome to the Pharmacy of Hell. Part 1. The Birth of the Monster, 1863 to 1900. To understand the origin of this monster, we must travel back in time. We must leave behind the cleanliness of modern laboratories and descend into the dirty, noisy chaos of the Industrial Revolution. Germany, 1863. The country is changing at a dizzying speed. The old medieval cities are being devoured by red brick factories that spew black smoke into the sky 24 hours a day. The air smells of sulfur and coal. The Rhine River, once a source of romantic poetry, is now an industrial artery contaminated by the chemical waste of a new era. In the small town of Barmen, today part of Wuppertal, 2 men form an unlikely partnership. Friedrich Bayer is a salesman, a man with a business instinct as sharp as a razor. Johann Friedrich Westcott is a master dyer, an alchemist of the modern era who knows how to manipulate chemicals to create colors. Originally, they did not want to cure anyone. They wanted to dye clothes. In those days, synthetic chemistry was in its infancy, and the big business was creating artificial dyes for the textile industry. The world wanted bright colors, fuchsine, aniline, and Bayer and Westcott were willing to give them to them. Their first factory was not a medical research center. It was a kitchen of poisons. Workers handled arsenic and heavy metals with their bare hands. Waste was dumped directly into the river. The life expectancy of an employee was short, but the profits were enormous. However, at the end of the 19th century, science took an unexpected turn. Chemists discovered that the same byproducts of coal tar, which were used to make blue and red dyes, also had strange effects on the human body. Some lowered fever, others took away pain. Bayer, always with his nose pointed at money, smelled an opportunity. The drug market was totally unregulated. There was no FDA, no mandatory clinical trials, no consumer protection laws. If you could bottle a liquid and convince people it cured something, you could get rich. The company decided to transform itself. They built a massive new complex in Elberfeld. They hired an army of young, ambitious chemists, giving them a single order: invent things we can patent. They were not looking for scientific truth. They were looking for intellectual property. They wanted molecules that belonged exclusively to them. In this atmosphere of chemical gold rush enters our tragic protagonist, a man whose name should be as famous as Louis Pasteur or Alexander Fleming, but whom history has relegated to an ambiguous footnote. His name was Felix Hoffmann. Felix Hoffmann did not look like a villain. He was a typical young German chemist of his time, meticulous, serious, with round glasses and a carefully groomed mustache. He worked in Bayer's pharmaceutical department under the supervision of Heinrich Dresser, a man whose ambition and lack of scruples would play a central role in this tragedy. Hoffmann had a personal motivation for his work. His father, a retired industrialist, suffered from paralyzing rheumatism. His joints were inflamed, and every movement was torture. At that time, the only common remedy for rheumatism was salicylic acid, a substance derived from willow bark. But salicylic acid had a terrible problem. It was corrosive. It burned patients' stomachs, causing ulcers and bloody vomiting. Hoffmann's father faced an impossible choice: live with unbearable pain in his knees, or live with unbearable pain in his stomach. Felix became obsessed with finding a solution. He spent nights in the laboratory, mixing flasks, looking for a way to modify the chemical structure of the acid to make it tolerable. And on August 10, 1897, he succeeded. Through a process called acetylation, Hoffmann managed to synthesize a pure and stable form of acetyl salicylic acid. He tested it first on himself, then on his father. The result was miraculous. The pain disappeared, and the stomach resisted. He had created the perfect painkiller. Bayer baptized it as aspirin, A for acetyl, and spear for the plant Spirea ulmaria, source of the acid. If the story had ended here, Felix Hoffmann would be remembered today as a secular saint, the man who took pain away from the world. Aspirin became the best-selling drug of all time, a magic pill that not only relieved pain, but, as we would discover decades later, prevented heart attacks. It was the white angel of pharmacology. But fate has a macabre sense of humor, because in that same laboratory, at that same workbench, only 11 days after discovering aspirin, Felix Hoffmann made the mistake that would condemn millions. On August 21, 1897, Hoffmann continued experimenting with acetylation. This time, he did not use salicylic acid. He used morphine. Morphine, derived from the opium poppy, was the most potent painkiller known, but it was highly addictive. The hospitals of Europe were full of soldiers and patients turned into morphine addicts. The medical community was desperately searching for a substitute, something that would calm coughs. Tuberculosis was the #1 cause of death, and pain, but that would not hook people. Hoffmann mixed morphine with acetic acid and heated it for hours. The result was a white, crystalline, odorless substance with a bitter taste. Chemically, it was called diacetylmorphine. Hoffmann did not know what he had just created. He thought he had done with morphine what he had done with aspirin: create a safer, more tolerable version. He could not have been more wrong. By acetylating morphine, he had made it much more lipid-soluble. This meant that when it entered the body, the substance could cross the blood-brain barrier, the brain's defense, much faster than original morphine. It was a bomb of concentrated power. As was customary at Bayer, the first test subjects were the factory workers themselves and the chemists. They were given the substance in small doses. Their reactions were immediate and ecstatic. The employees reported that their cough disappeared instantly. But more importantly, they reported a strange and powerful sensation. They said they felt euphoric, invincible, capable of anything. Their fear went away, their fatigue went away, their sadness went away. In German, they described the sensation as heroisch, heroic. Heinrich Dresser, Hoffmann's boss, saw the reports and his eyes gleamed. He did not see danger. He saw a brand. If it makes them feel like heroes, he said, then we will call it heroin. And so, in an act of corporate baptism that today seems like a joke in bad taste, the most infamous trademark in history was born. The angel and the demon had been born in the same month from the same father. But while aspirin was destined to heal, heroin was destined to enslave. What happened next is perhaps the most shameful chapter in the history of modern medicine. Today, we associate heroin with dirty syringes, dark alleys, and destroyed lives. But in 1898, Bayer's heroin came to market dressed in gala attire. Bayer launched a global advertising campaign that would make today's marketing agencies pale. They did not sell heroin as a last resort for terminal patients. They sold it as a family medicine. Imagine opening a health magazine of the time. You turn the page and see a touching illustration. A young mother with her hair pulled back, holding a spoon in front of the mouth of a small, crying child. The text in elegant typography says, "The cough disappears. The child sleeps peacefully. Bayer heroin, the safe sedative for coughs." Bayer sent thousands of free samples to doctors in Europe and the United States. They gave away vials of pure heroin to doctors so they could try them with their patients. And the company's official recommendation was chilling. Its use was suggested for bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis, and even for menstrual cramps. But the biggest lie, the one that really turned this into a crime, was the safety claim. Heinrich Dresser, the laboratory chief who received royalties for every gram of heroin sold, published scientific articles categorically stating that heroin was not addictive. What is more, Bayer had the audacity to market heroin as the cure for morphine addiction. The logic was perverse. If you have a patient addicted to morphine, give him heroin. It is more potent, so he needs less quantity, and since it is not addictive, you will be able to cure him. It was like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it. Thousands of morphine addicts switched to heroin, discovering with horror that the new drug was infinitely more difficult to quit. Bayer's remedy turned a medical crisis into a social epidemic. During the first decade of the 20th century, heroin production at the Bayer plant exploded. They produced tons every year. It was exported all over the world. In the United States, you could buy Bayer heroin syrup by mail without a prescription. Mountaineers took it to have more endurance in the mountains. Opera singers used it to clear their throats before a concert. It was the fashionable drug. It was the Coca-Cola of painkillers. The profits from heroin financed Bayer's massive expansion. Those beautiful brick buildings in Leverkusen, the modern laboratories, the villas of the executives, everything was built brick by brick with the money of addicts. The company became a global giant, respected and admired. But in the shadows, reality was beginning to crack the marketing facade. Starting in 1902, letters began to arrive at Bayer's offices. Letters from concerned doctors. Letters from directors of psychiatric asylums. They reported strange cases, patients who, once their cough was cured, refused to stop taking the syrup. Mothers who sold their jewelry to buy more medicine for their children. Respectable men who lost their jobs and ended up begging in the streets with gray skin and sunken eyes, begging for one more dose of the heroic drug. A new medical term was coined, heroinism. In the hospitals of New York and Philadelphia, emergency rooms filled with a new class of zombies. They were the first heroin addicts in history, and they all had something in common. They had started their addiction with a bottle that had the Bayer cross on the label. The international medical community began to sound the alarm. By 1910, reports on the toxicity and addictive capacity of heroin were impossible to ignore. It was shown that the body metabolized heroin, converting it back into morphine, but at a speed and concentration that the brain could not handle. And what did Bayer do in the face of this overwhelming evidence? Here we see the true face of the corporation. There was no voluntary withdrawal. There was no public apology. There was an aggressive defense strategy. Karl Duisberg, Bayer's new strongman, a character we will see much more of in this story, ordered his representatives to silence the critics. They said that doctors did not know how to use the product, that cases of addiction were anomalies or the fault of the moral weakness of patients. Bayer continued producing and selling heroin until 1913, when legal and public pressure became unsustainable. But even then, they did not stop global sales immediately. They continued selling it in countries with laxer regulations for years. When production finally officially ceased, the damage was already incalculable. Bayer had created a plague. They had released the genie from the bottle, and that genie had a needle in its hand. The legacy of Felix Hoffmann is a painful paradox. He died in 1946, alone and forgotten in Switzerland. In his obituary, his invention of aspirin was celebrated. No one mentioned the other daughter. But history does not forget. However, for Bayer's executives, the heroin crisis was not a moral failure. It was simply a commercial setback. They had learned a valuable lesson. Chemistry has absolute power over human life, and that power is monetizable. As the world prepared for World War I, Bayer was no longer thinking about cough syrups. They were thinking about something bigger. If they could manipulate molecules to kill pain, could they not also manipulate them to kill enemies? The innocence of science had died in that heroin flask. Now the door was opening to a new era. An era where chemists would not wear white coats, but military uniforms. An era where the objective would not be to cure individuals, but to exterminate entire armies. In the next chapter, we will leave civilian hospitals and enter the mud-filled trenches of Ypres. We will see how the Council of Gods of the German chemical industry met to create the ultimate weapon. We will see how Bayer went from selling poison in small bottles to launching poison in green clouds that burned the lungs of thousands of soldiers in seconds. The pharmacy of hell has just opened its doors, and hell is about to be unleashed. Part 2. The Gas, 1914 to 1918. 1914. Europe is a powder keg about to explode, and Germany is the match. In Leverkusen, the city that Bayer had built practically from scratch to house its empire, the chimneys no longer just spew white steam smoke. They begin to spew something denser, darker. Felix Hoffmann was the naive scientist who created heroin by accident. The man who now sits on Bayer's throne is a very different creature. His name is Karl Duisberg. Duisberg is not a simple chemist. He is a titan. He is the Napoleon of the chemical industry, a man with an imperial mustache who lives in a palatial villa within the factory compound, surrounded by Japanese gardens and servants. While a few meters from his window, thousands of workers breathe toxic fumes. Duisberg has a worldview terrifying in its simplicity. Chemistry is power, and the duty of industry is not to serve humanity, but to serve the German state and the shareholders. When World War I breaks out in August 1914, most companies see the conflict with fear. Duisberg sees it as the ultimate opportunity. The German army, the most feared war machine on the planet, has a critical problem. Germany is blockaded by the British Navy. They cannot import saltpeter from Chile, the essential ingredient for making gunpowder and explosives. Without nitrates, the Kaiser's cannons will fall silent in 6 months. The high military command panics. They summon the industrialists, and here is where Karl Duisberg and his chemistry colleagues make a Faustian pact that will change history. They promise the Kaiser that German science will solve what geography denies them. "Give us money," they say, "and we will extract explosives from the air." They were referring to the nitrogen fixation process developed by another infamous name, Fritz Haber. Bayer, along with its competitors BASF and Hoechst, transforms its production lines overnight. The machines that pressed aspirin tablets are reconfigured. The tanks that mixed cough syrup are filled with nitric acid and toluene. The pharmacy of hell stops pretending it cares about health. It officially becomes the Reich's armory. In Leverkusen, millions of tons of high-power explosives are manufactured. Every bullet that kills a French soldier at the Marne, every shell that destroys a trench at the Somme, bears the invisible seal of the chemical industry that Duisburg directs. But explosives were just the beginning. Trench warfare stagnated. The generals needed something new, something that could get the rats out of their holes, something that would kill not with brute force, but with scientific terror. And Karl Duisberg had the answer in his dye laboratories. April 22, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. It is a deceptively beautiful spring afternoon. In the Allied trenches, French and Algerian soldiers rest. They have been fighting for months, but today the front is quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, at 5 in the afternoon, the lookouts notice something strange in the German lines. It is not an infantry attack. It is not a bombardment. It is a cloud, a dense fog of an unnatural yellow-green color that crawls close to the ground, moved by a gentle north wind toward the Allied trenches. The soldiers look at it with curiosity. Is it smoke to hide in advance? Is it a strange weather condition? Then the cloud reaches the first line and hell breaks loose. The air fills with a pungent smell, a mixture of rotten pineapple and pool chlorine concentrated 1,000 times. The men begin to cough, but it is not a normal cough. It is a violent convulsion. They put their hands to their throats. Their eyes burn as if acid had been thrown on them. Chlorine gas, upon contact with the moisture in the lungs, turns into hydrochloric acid. Literally, the soldiers are dissolving from the inside. They drown in their own fluids on dry land. The panic is total. Thousands of men come out of the trenches, running blindly, spitting blood, falling to the ground with their skin blue from lack of oxygen. The French line collapses in minutes. 6,000 men die that afternoon in a way so horrible that even the most hardened veterans cry when they see it. That gas did not appear out of nowhere. It was manufactured, bottled, and supplied by the great German chemical companies, with Bayer at the forefront. Karl Duisberg was not horrified. He was proud. He personally visited the front to see the results of his work. For him and for Fritz Haber, gas was not a war crime. It was a humane way to shorten the conflict. Death by gas is sweeter than being torn apart by a grenade, they said in their private clubs while smoking cigars. Bayer threw itself completely into the production of chemical weapons. In its factories, a school of chemical warfare was created. Yes, a corporate school. There, officers of the German army did not learn to heal. They learned the best way to disperse poison according to wind direction. Bayer's scientists, the same ones who had sought the cure for rheumatism, now calculated the necessary density of phosgene to kill a battalion in 3 minutes. The escalation was rapid and brutal. Chlorine was easy to detect, so they invented something worse. Phosgene, an invisible gas that smells like freshly cut hay and kills hours after breathing it, when the lungs fill with fluid while the victim sleeps. And then came the king of horrors, mustard gas, also known as the Yellow Cross. This gas, mass-produced in Bayer's plants, did not need to be breathed. It was a vesicant agent. If it touched your skin, it burned you. If it touched your clothes, it went through them. Soldiers who survived mustard attacks were left blind, with their bodies covered in giant blisters filled with yellow pus, coughing up pieces of their own bronchial lining. It was a chemical torture designed to last weeks before death. For 4 years, German science, financed by the marks of Bayer and its partners, turned the fields of Europe into an extermination laboratory. And while the soldiers died, the company's shares rose. War was, above all, an excellent business. 1918. Germany loses the war. The Kaiser flees. The Treaty of Versailles tries to bring the nation to its knees. The Allies confiscate Bayer's patents. In the United States, Bayer's subsidiary is auctioned off as enemy property. This is how Sterling Drug is born, which would sell Bayer aspirins in America for decades without having any relationship with Germany. It seemed like the end. Bayer had lost its markets, its international patents, and its reputation. But Karl Duisberg was not a man who accepted defeat. He looked at the post-war landscape with its hyperinflation and political chaos and reached a conclusion that would define the 20th century. Competition is a luxury we cannot afford, he said. We must become one body. Duisberg proposed something radical, not a simple alliance, but a total merger of the entire German chemical industry. Bayer, BASF, Hoechst, Agfa, Griesheim Elektron, and Weiler Thermier, all the giants that had manufactured gas and explosives, should unite under a single command. In 1925, Duisberg's dream came true. E.J. Farben Industrie AG was born. The name was technical and boring, community of interests of the dye industry. But the reality was that the most powerful corporation in Europe, and possibly the world, had just been born. E.J. Farben was not a normal company. It was a supranational state. It had its own foreign policy. It had its own industrial espionage network. It had coal mines, power plants, banks, and railways. It controlled 100% of German dye production, 85% of explosives, and almost all drug production. If you were a German in 1925, E.J. Farben owned your life. The aspirin you took was theirs. The film in your camera was theirs. The fertilizer that grew your food was theirs. And although you did not know it, the gas that would kill you in the future would also be theirs. Karl Duisberg became president of the supervisory board. He was the god of this new chemical Olympus. He built the largest office building in Europe in Frankfurt, the E.J. Farben building, a colossal structure of travertine and marble that screamed power and domination. The elevators did not stop on all floors. The executives were physically above the employees. In these Frankfurt offices, the Council of Gods, as the directors called themselves, began to plan the future. They did not care about the Weimar Republic. They did not care about democracy. They cared about order, efficiency, and profit. And in the late 20s, they began to notice an agitator politician in Munich, a man with a small mustache and a hypnotic voice who spoke of restoring Germany's greatness, of breaking the chains of Versailles, and of conquering living space in the East. At first, the corporate aristocrats of I.G. Farben looked at Adolf Hitler with disdain. They considered him a vulgar bohemian corporal. But Karl Duisberg and his successors were pragmatic. They listened to what Hitler promised: rearmament, self-sufficiency, elimination of communist unions. Hitler needed synthetic rubber for his trucks because Germany had no tropical colonies. He needed synthetic gasoline for his tanks because Germany had no oil. And there was only one entity in the world capable of creating those miracles on an industrial scale: I.G. Farben. Chemistry and Nazism were made for each other. Both believed in technical superiority. Both believed in remodeling the world through will and science. And both completely lacked human compassion. In 1932, 1 year before Hitler took power, a crucial meeting took place. I.G. Farben executives opened their checkbooks. They financed the Nazi Party's electoral campaign with millions of marks. It was the best investment in their history. When Hitler became chancellor, IG Farben became the regime's company. And Bayer, as one of the founding pillars of the cartel, was ready for its darkest act. They had gone from heroin to mustard gas. Now they were preparing for something even worse: industrial slavery and mechanized genocide. The stage was set. The Auschwitz factory was about to be drawn on the blueprints, and Zyklon B gas, a simple blue pesticide, was waiting in the warehouses for its terrible destiny. Part 3. Auschwitz, 1933 to 1945. Berlin, February 20th, 1933. The night is freezing, but inside the official residence of the President of the Reichstag, the atmosphere is electric. Hermann Göring has summoned the industrial elite of Germany. The richest men in the country, the owners of chimneys and mines, get out of their dark limousines. Among them, walking with the confidence of one who knows he owns the future, are the executives of IG Farben, with the spirit of Karl Duisberg floating above them. Adolf Hitler enters the room. He does not shout. He does not gesticulate as he does in public squares. He speaks calmly to the businessmen. He promises them order. He promises them that the unions will be crushed. He promises them that the German army will once again be the greatest in the world. But above all, he asks them for something: money. Funds for the electoral campaign that will consolidate his absolute power. The IG Farben executives do not hesitate. They are pragmatic. They know that the war Hitler is planning will require chemicals on a scale never seen before. That night, the chemical cartel signs a check for 400,000 imperial marks. It is the largest donation of the night. It is the down payment on a partnership that will turn Bayer's laboratories and its partners into the architects of an industrial nightmare. From that moment on, the distinction between the Nazi state and IG Farben disappears. They become one entity. The government provides the capital and the objectives. The company provides the science and the execution. Hitler knows that without the chemists of Leverkusen and Frankfurt, his tanks would stop for lack of fuel, and his soldiers would march barefoot for lack of rubber. And IG Farben becomes the Ministry of Chemistry of the Third Reich. But while engineers design processes to synthesize gasoline from coal, in the pesticide departments, a horror of a different nature is being gestated. A horror that is not measured in octanes, but in human lives per minute. Let us return for a moment to Bayer's laboratories in the 20s. There, a team of scientists had perfected a product for public hygiene. Zyklon B was small plaster pellets impregnated with hydrogen cyanide. It was used to disinfect barracks, ships, and trains. It was an extremely effective poison against lice, carriers of typhus. By law, Zyklon B had to contain a warning agent, an irritating chemical substance that gave off an acrid smell and made eyes water. It was an essential safety measure. If a human smelled that, he knew he should run. It was the difference between a pesticide and a chemical weapon. However, in 1941, when Nazi leaders at the Wannsee Conference decided that mass murder should be industrialized, the orders for Zyklon B arriving at Degisch, the subsidiary controlled by IG Farben, began to change. The SS made an unusual technical request. They asked that Zyklon B be manufactured without the warning agent. They wanted an odorless gas. They wanted victims not to know they were dying until it was too late. IG Farben executives could have said no. They could have alleged safety regulations or medical ethics. But they did not. On the contrary, they accelerated production. They understood perfectly what an odorless pesticide would be used for in a concentration camp. The gas that once saved lives by killing lice was now going to be the main tool for the extermination of millions. Every can of Zyklon B that arrived at Auschwitz carried a profit stamp for IG Farben. Death became a mass consumer product, with invoices, delivery deadlines, and quality controls. The pharmacy of hell had found its star product, murder by catalog. But gas was only part of the business. IG-Farben had a much more ambitious project. They wanted to build the largest chemical plant in the history of humanity, an industrial city that would be the pride of German technology. They called it the Buna plant, named after their synthetic rubber. They were looking for a place with three characteristics: access to railway lines, abundance of water, and an inexhaustible source of cheap labor. They found the perfect site in Upper Silesia, near a crossroads called Auschwitz. There, IG-Farben did not just collaborate with the Auschwitz concentration camp. They built their own camp. It was called Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. It was the first concentration camp in history financed, built, and managed by a private company. A pharmaceutical and chemical corporation now owned slaves. Imagine the scale of construction. Thousands of tons of steel, kilometers of pipes, gigantic reactors that rose like metal cathedrals. And beneath those structures, a mass of human beings turned into spare parts. Prisoners who arrived on cattle trains were subjected to immediate selection. Those who were considered fit for work were not sent to the SS gas chambers. Not yet. They were sent to the IG-Farben factory. They were rented by the company to the Nazi state for a daily rate. 4 marks for a skilled worker, 3 marks for a laborer. For Bayer and IG-Farben management, these men and women were calories that were transformed into work. The logic was brutally simple. A prisoner had to produce more value in work than his food and lodging cost. And since the food was dirty water with potato peelings, and the lodging was rat-infested wooden barracks, the profit was immense. Life expectancy in Monowitz was even lower than in other camps. The work in the construction of the Buna plant was exhausting. Prisoners had to carry 50-kilogram cement bags while running under the whips of German foremen. If a man fell and could not get up, the foreman made a signal. The man was set aside and sent on the next truck to Auschwitz II, Birkenau, to be gassed with Zyklon B, produced by the same company for which he had just worked. It was a perfect and terrifying human recycling machine. It is at this point that we enter Bayer's secret archives that we mentioned earlier. We must stop at them because they represent the height of scientific dehumanization. While the rubber factory grew, Bayer's pharmaceutical laboratories in Leverkusen needed data. They wanted to test new vaccines against typhus, new anesthetics, and new chemical drugs. But the laws of science require human testing. This is where business letters become evidence of a crime against humanity. Bayer executives wrote to the Auschwitz commandant with the coldness of someone ordering office supplies. We need a batch of 150 healthy women to test a new preparation. When the camp responded with a price of 200 marks per woman, Bayer haggled. It is too expensive. We offer 170 per head. That difference of 30 marks is the measure of corporate morality of the time. Finally, the deal was closed. The 150 women were delivered. Bayer scientists injected them with experimental substances. They were not looking to cure them. They were looking to observe how long it took them to die, or what devastating side effects the drugs produced on their organs. The final letter, written with Bayer's official typography, said, "The experiments have concluded. All subjects have died. We will contact you for the next shipment." All have died. There was no note of regret. There was no internal investigation, only the need for more material. But there was someone else at Auschwitz who worked closely with Bayer's chemists. A man whose name has become synonymous with medical nightmare, Dr. Joseph Mengele. Mengele was not a lone madman. He was a researcher seeking academic prestige in the New Germany, and much of his funding and supplies came from IG-Farben. The company supplied him with experimental drugs to test on twins and children. Mengele, in return, sent human organs, blood samples, and detailed notes from his autopsies to the company's laboratories for analysis. There was a constant flow of human tissues traveling from the crematoria of Auschwitz to the microscopes of Bayer's scientists. Science for a better life had become science for an efficient death. As the war advanced toward its inevitable end, the Buna plant at Auschwitz never produced a single gram of synthetic rubber. Allied bombing and technical difficulties prevented it. But that did not mean IG Farben lost money. The company charged for every phase of the process. They charged for construction. They charged for Zyklon B gas sold to the SS for the gas chambers. They charged for medical experiments. Auschwitz was, for Bayer and its partners, an immense billing operation based on extermination. The executives lived in a bubble of luxury, while, a few kilometers away, their slaves died of hunger. They held gala dinners in the factory dining rooms, toasting with champagne to new technical advances. They were convinced they were the owners of the new world order. They believed that history is written by the victors, and they felt undefeated. Even when the Red Army was a few kilometers from the factory in January 1945, the executives' greatest concern was destroying the archives. Thousands of documents were burned. The evidence of the purchase of the 150 women, the gas supply contracts, the photos of management inspections of the slave barracks. Everything had to disappear. But German bureaucracy was too efficient for its own good. Many copies of these letters were kept in other departments. Many subordinate workers could not burn everything. And when Allied soldiers finally entered Leverkusen and Frankfurt, they discovered the paper trail of the pharmacy of hell. The liberation of Auschwitz revealed to the world an IG Farben factory surrounded by corpses. American prosecutors, led by Telford Taylor, could not believe what they saw. They were not judging brutal soldiers. They were judging the most cultured and educated men in Germany, doctors of chemistry, finance experts, industry leaders. In 1947, the IG Farben trial began in Nuremberg. It was the sixth of the secondary trials. Prosecutor Taylor was blunt in his opening. These men are not simply war criminals. They are the necessary facilitators of evil. Without IG Farben, Hitler would not have had the gas for his chambers, nor the rubber for his tanks, nor the gasoline for his planes. They are the true architects of the Holocaust. The Bayer executives sat in the dock. They looked indignant. They argued that they were only businessmen following orders. They said they did not know what was happening in the gas chambers, despite the fact that they themselves sold the gas and managed the slave camp next door. It seemed that the world was finally going to do justice, but international politics was about to intervene. The Cold War was beginning. The United States needed a strong, rebuilt Germany to stop the Soviet Union. And to rebuild Germany, they needed the chemists. They needed the executives. They needed IG Farben. What happened after the trials is perhaps the greatest slap in the face to the victims in history. The verdict was astonishingly lenient. Many of the executives who had signed the orders to purchase slaves were sentenced to only a few years in prison. Others were acquitted. And most incredibly, the order to dissolve IG Farben ended up resulting in the rebirth of its original parts. In 1952, Bayer was reborn as an independent company. The same men who had managed the horror during the war simply took off the cartel's uniform and put on the suit of the new Bayer. Fritz Termeer, an IG Farben executive convicted of slavery and mass murder at Nuremberg, left prison after only 5 years for good behavior. And what did he do? He was appointed chairman of Bayer's supervisory board. The man who oversaw the horror of Auschwitz was back in command of Science for a Better Life. The pharmacy of hell not only survived the war, it became stronger. They washed their image with the German economic miracle. They turned their war laboratories into modern pesticide and mass consumer medicine laboratories. The world decided to forget because it needed the pills and chemicals of Leverkusen. But the shadow of Auschwitz never left the company. The DNA of a corporation is not erased with a name change or a marketing campaign. The methods of manipulation, the lack of ethics, and the absolute priority of profit over human life would continue to appear in the following decades in scandals of contaminated blood and toxic herbicides. In the next part, we will see how post-war Bayer conquered the world, hiding its Nazi past under a mountain of advertising, while preparing for new crimes in the modern era. The Hell no longer wore SS uniforms. Now it wore a lab coat and a corporate smile. Part 4. The Great Amnesia, 1945 to 1990. This is part 4 of 6. In this installment, we delve into the great post-war amnesia. It is the story of how justice knelt before political convenience, and how the men who should have spent the rest of their lives behind bars for crimes against humanity ended up recovering their luxury offices and their titles of president. To achieve the length and depth you seek, this script delves into the psychology of the Cold War, the details of the Nuremberg trials, and the brazen return of war criminals to command of the new Bayer. 1945. Germany is a lunar landscape of crushed bricks, smoke, and silence. In Leverkusen, Bayer's chimneys have stopped roaring. The buildings that were once the vanguard of world science are partially in ruins, marked by the scars of Allied bombing. The Council of Gods has fallen from its Olympus. The executives who yesterday toasted the efficiency of Auschwitz today hide in their basements, frantically burning files while listening to the roar of American tanks crossing the Rhine. It seemed that the world was finally going to settle accounts with the pharmacy of hell. Allied soldiers who entered the IG-Farben complexes found something more than laboratories. They found evidence of a depravity that defied all logic. They found the invoices for Zyklon B gas. They found the letters of purchase of the 150 women from Auschwitz for 170 marks each. They found research reports detailing how long it took for a human lung to collapse under the effect of their gases. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon seeing the magnitude of industrial complicity with the Holocaust, was categorical. He ordered that IG-Farben be completely dissolved. The company is a threat to world peace, he said. The original plans were to dismantle every pipe, sell every reactor, and forever prohibit those men from manufacturing even a single aspirin again. The world demanded justice, and justice seemed to be on its way. But while the rubble of war was still hot, a new fear began to seep through the cracks of international diplomacy. A fear that Bayer and its executives knew how to exploit with Machiavellian mastery. The Cold War was being born. The Iron Curtain was falling over Europe, and suddenly the United States and Great Britain realized something uncomfortable. To stop the advance of the Soviet Union, they needed West Germany to be an economic power again. And for Germany to be a power, they needed the chemists. They needed the managers. They needed the same men who had served Hitler. Justice was about to be sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical convenience. The pharmacy of hell was about to receive a second chance, and it would do so with a cynicism that would leave the world speechless. In August 1947, what should have been the definitive trial against corporate power began. The IG-Farben trial was the 6th of the 12 trials held before the United States military tribunals in Nuremberg. In the dock were not uniformed soldiers, but 24 of the brightest and most educated executives in Germany. Doctors, engineers, financiers. The elite of Bayer, BASF, and Hext. Chief Prosecutor Telford Taylor opened the case with words that still resonate in the archives of history. These men are not simply war criminals in the traditional sense. They are the technocrats of extermination. Without their science, without their logistics, Without their corporate ambition, Hitler could never have carried out his plans of conquest and genocide. The charges were overwhelming: planning a war of aggression, looting of property in occupied countries, mass slavery, and murder. The evidence of what happened at the Buna plant in Auschwitz-Monowitz was irrefutable. Prosecutors presented documents signed by the defendants themselves, where the mortality rate of prisoners was discussed as a simple production variable. But the defendants showed not an iota of remorse. They appeared before the court in impeccable suits, with an arrogance that outraged the survivors present in the courtroom. Their defense was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. They argued that they were simple businessmen, that they had no power over political decisions. They said they did not know what Zyklon B was used for, despite the fact that they themselves managed the subsidiaries that distributed it. They claimed that the use of slaves was an order from the SS that they could not disobey without risking their own lives. "We were only following the laws of the war economy," they said. For them, the 150 women bought at Auschwitz were not people. They were statistical data. What the world expected was an exemplary sentence: the gallows for the ringleaders and life imprisonment for the rest. But the political climate had changed. In Washington, the priority was no longer to punish the Nazis, but to rebuild Germany as a wall against communism. The American judges, influenced by this change of winds, handed down sentences that were received with horror by the victims. Of the 24 defendants, 10 were completely acquitted. The other 13 received ridiculous sentences of between 1 and 8 years in prison. And most insultingly, the time they had already spent in custody was subtracted from their sentences. The message was clear. Corporate crime, even when it involves genocide, has a very low price if you are useful to the new owners of the world. Fritz Termeer, the executive who personally supervised the construction of the slave factory at Auschwitz, and who defended the use of prisoners, arguing that they were not used to working anyway, was sentenced to only 7 years. He left prison in 1950 after serving less than 3 years for good behavior. The pharmacy of hell had not only survived the trial, it had won. The path was clear for resurrection. 1951. IG Farben, the giant that Eisenhower wanted to destroy, was formally divided. But it was not destroyed. It simply separated into its original components: Bayer, BASF, and Höchst. It was as if the monster had divided into 3, each with the same genetics, the same ambition, and the same leaders. Bayer was officially reborn as an independent company in Leverkusen. And here is where the story becomes truly disturbing. Anyone would think that after a scandal of such magnitude, the company would try to distance itself from its former Nazi leaders. They would look for new faces, young blood, a new ethic. But they did exactly the opposite. In an unprecedented display of cynicism, the same men who had just left Allied prisons were invited to occupy their old positions again. Fritz Termeer, the man who bought women at Auschwitz, the convicted war criminal, did not hide in exile. In 1956, he was appointed chairman of Bayer's supervisory board. Yes, the man who oversaw the industrial Holocaust was now the face of the new democratic Bayer. He was not the only one. The list of post-war Bayer executives looks like a census of the Nuremberg trials. Ulrich Haberland, another IG Farben veteran, was appointed managing director. Karl Wurster, another regime collaborator, took command of Höchst. The pharmacy of hell was not only still open, the same pharmacists were back at the counter. Then began the greatest image-washing operation in corporate history. Bayer needed the world to forget the gas chambers and remember aspirin. They invested astronomical sums in advertising. The slogan, "Science for a Better Life," was engraved in the minds of consumers. The Bayer Cross shone again in stadiums, in pharmacies around the world, and on billboards from New York to Tokyo. They recovered their international patents. They fought in courts to once again own the Aspirin brand in all markets. They presented themselves to the world as the symbol of the German economic miracle, a company of peaceful scientists dedicated to progress and the health of humanity. Leverkusen once again became a prosperous city, and the people who lived there, many of whom had worked in the factory during the war, kept silent. The past was buried under a mountain of German marks and promises of prosperity. But the DNA of a corporation does not change with a marketing campaign. The culture of the company, that culture of profit at any cost, inherited from Karl Duisberg and the barons of IG Farben, remained intact in the corridors of Leverkusen. And in the 60s and 70s, that lack of scruples would manifest itself again in a series of disasters that would demonstrate that the hell never left. It just changed its SS uniform for a white lab coat and a salesman's smile. Although Bayer tries to distance itself from other pharmaceutical disasters of the time, the mentality of the German chemical industry of the post-war period remained the same. A key example of this era is the thalidomide scandal, marketed in Germany as Contergan. Although the original manufacturer was Grunenthal, the network of patents, chemists, and marketing of the time was dominated by the Leverkusen school. Bayer, meanwhile, launched itself into the conquest of new markets in the Third World. In Latin America and Southeast Asia, the company found the perfect scenario to expand without the annoying regulations that were beginning to emerge in Europe and the United States. They began selling extremely toxic pesticides, many of which were direct derivatives of war poison gas research. Farmers in Brazil and Colombia were sold chemicals that were lethal not only to insects, but to human beings. The same chemists who had calculated the toxicity of Zyklon B now calculated the potency of organophosphates. Thousands of rural workers became ill, suffered malformations, and died, while Bayer sales representatives assured, just as they did with heroin in 1900, that their products were completely safe if used correctly. The company also began to diversify into the world of blood products and vaccines. And here, in the 70s and 80s, one of its most modern and lethal crimes would be gestated. A crime that would demonstrate that for the pharmacy of hell, a human life still had the same value it had at Auschwitz, the price of a quarterly profit. By the end of the 60s, Bayer was once again one of the largest and most respected companies on the planet. Fritz Termeer died in 1967 as a distinguished citizen, showered with honors and riches. At his funeral, he was remembered as a pioneer of industry and a visionary of chemistry. Not a single word about the 150 women, not a single mention of the slaves of Monowitz. The amnesia was total. Bayer had achieved the impossible: separate its product from its history. Millions of people around the world took their medicines every day without knowing that the foundations of that company were built on a mass grave. The Bayer cross had become a symbol of hope, while the gas they manufactured remained the symbol of absolute horror. But history is not a straight line of progress. It is a circle that always returns to the starting point. The arrogance of the executives, the conviction that they were above law and morality, would prepare the ground for the next great horror. Because in Bayer's laboratories, a new virus was about to cross paths with corporate greed. In the next part, we will enter the modern era. We will narrate the chilling scandal of blood contaminated with HIV, where Bayer knowingly sold deadly medicine to thousands of hemophiliac children just to not lose their investment. We will see how the spirit of Auschwitz survived in the 80s and 90s, and how the pharmacy of hell continued to claim lives while the world looked the other way. Part 5. The Contaminated Blood, 1975 to 2000. By the end of the 70s, Bayer was no longer a company trying to redeem itself. It was an undisputed world power. The Bayer cross dominated the global health market. They had left behind the soot of coal factories to enter the era of biotechnology and precision medicine. Their laboratories were glass temples, where solutions were designed for problems that were previously considered death sentences. One of those problems was hemophilia, a cruel genetic disease that prevents blood from clotting. For a hemophiliac, a small blow to the knee can mean unbearable internal bleeding. A simple cut can be fatal. For centuries, these patients lived in fear, going in and out of hospitals with an extremely short life expectancy. But then, Bayer's biological division, known in the United States as Cutter Biological, presented a miracle drug, Factor VIII. It was a concentrate of proteins extracted from human plasma. For hemophiliacs, Factor VIII was freedom. They could inject themselves at home and lead a normal life. The product was so valuable and so expensive to produce that in financial circles it was called liquid gold. The profits for Bayer were massive. But the production of this gold hid a dirty secret in its supply chain. To manufacture a single dose of Factor VIII, Bayer needed plasma from thousands of donors. And to maximize their profits, the company did not always look for the healthiest donors. In a system reminiscent of the lack of ethics of its founding years, the company obtained plasma from high-risk populations: prisoners in United States jails, drug addicts in marginal neighborhoods, and people in third-world countries who sold their blood for a few dollars to be able to eat. The plasma of 10,000 different people was mixed in huge tanks. It was a biological Russian roulette. If a single donor among those 10,000 had a viral disease, the entire batch was contaminated. Bayer knew it. Their scientists perfectly understood the risk of hepatitis and other viruses. But the business was too profitable to stop for statistical possibilities. And then, in the early 80s, a new ghost appeared on the horizon: HIV. The AIDS virus was beginning to decimate populations, and no one knew exactly how it was transmitted, until hemophiliacs began to die. By 1983, the evidence was undeniable. Bayer's Factor VIII was transmitting AIDS to its patients. Hemophiliac children who had been treated with the product to be able to play and run like others were testing positive for HIV. It was a tragedy of biblical proportions. Families who had trusted the Bayer cross to save their children now saw them wasting away from an incurable disease. Bayer and Cutter Biological faced a corporate dilemma. They could immediately withdraw the product, lose millions of dollars in inventory, and admit the error, or they could try to save their investment. In 1984, Bayer developed a new technical process. They discovered that heating the Factor VIII concentrate eliminated the HIV virus, making the medicine safe. It was a victory of science. They immediately began selling the new heated product in the United States and Western Europe. Patients in New York, London, and Berlin were safe. But here is where the pharmacy of hell revealed its true face, the same one it had shown in the heroin years and in the barracks of Auschwitz. Bayer still had in its warehouses millions of dollars in old Factor VIII, product that they knew with total scientific certainty was contaminated with the AIDS virus. They had two options: destroy it and assume the losses, or sell it in places where laws were weaker and people were more desperate. They chose the second option. Internal company documents that would come to light years later in journalistic investigations and mass trials showed a commercial strategy that can only be described as criminal. While Bayer sold the safe product in rich countries, It continued exporting the contaminated product to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Argentina, and Mexico. Imagine being a Bayer executive in 1985. You have in front of you a report that says the batch of Factor VIII destined for Taiwan has a high probability of containing HIV. You know there is a new, safe product available in the next room. But you also know that if you send the old product, the company's numbers at the end of the month will look much better. Bayer sent the old product. They fought to prevent the authorities in those countries from demanding the safe product. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, company representatives argued that the old product was equally safe and that the new one was too expensive. They actively deceived local doctors and health ministries. The result was a silent massacre. Thousands of hemophiliacs in Asia and Latin America were knowingly infected by the company. Many of them were children. In Taiwan, more than 100 hemophiliacs contracted AIDS directly from Bayer's medicine. In Hong Kong, the figure was similar. When activists and victims' families began to ask questions, Bayer's response was the same one they used at the Nuremberg trials: denial and obfuscation. They said that at that time the science was not clear, despite the fact that their own internal documents said exactly the opposite. They said they had acted ethically according to the standards of the time. The cruelty of this decision is difficult to process. It was not a technical error. It was an accounting decision. For Bayer, the life of a child in Malaysia or Argentina was worth less than the cost of discarding a batch of old medicine. It was the spirit of IG Farben, reincarnated in the era of globalization. The idea that certain populations are expendable if corporate profit is high enough. In the late 90s, the scandal finally exploded in the international press. Thanks to investigations by the New York Times and other media, Bayer faced an avalanche of lawsuits. But once again, the pharmacy of hell demonstrated that it knows how to handle the system. Instead of going to trial and risking that its executives would end up in prison, or that the complete truth would be recorded in the public record, Bayer used its immense financial power to silence the problem. They paid hundreds of millions of dollars in out-of-court settlements to victims and their families. But these settlements had a trap. They came with strict confidentiality clauses. Victims received money for their medical treatments, but in exchange, they were prohibited from speaking to the press or admitting that Bayer was guilty. The company bought the silence of the dying. There was never a sincere public apology. There was never an executive prosecuted for murder or criminal negligence. For Bayer, the contaminated blood scandal was simply another cost of doing business, a negative figure on the balance sheet that would be offset next year with the sale of a new pesticide or a new cholesterol pill. This scandal demonstrated that the denazification of the company was only superficial. The power structure, the priority of the dividend over ethics, and the vision of patients as simple risk consumers remained the core of the company. As they entered the new millennium, Bayer was preparing for its next great transformation. They had consolidated in pharmacy, but they wanted to dominate something more fundamental than medicine: food. They wanted to control what the world eats, from seed to plate. To achieve this, the pharmacy of hell set its sights on another company with a reputation as dark as its own. An American company that had created Agent Orange and PCBS. A company called Monsanto. The union of these two giants would create the most powerful and dangerous chemical monopoly in the history of humanity. An entity that would not only control your medicines, but also the DNA of your food. In the next and final part, we will see the final act of this tragedy. We will narrate the purchase of Monsanto, the battle over glyphosate, and how Bayer, after 160 years of scandals, wars, and death, remains one of the most powerful companies in the world. we will discover that perhaps the Bayer cross is not a symbol of help, but the mark of an empire that has never stopped seeing human beings as simple merchandise. Part 6. The Marriage of Hell, 2000 to present. Upon reaching the 21st century, the pharmacy of hell was no longer content with dominating hospitals and medicine cabinets. Its leaders, spiritual heirs of Karl Duisberg's ambition, understood that there was something more fundamental than medicine to control humanity. Food. If you can control what people eat, if you can own the seed before it touches the ground, you have a power that no 20th century dictator could dream of. Bayer was already a giant in the pesticide sector, but it wanted total monopoly. In the year 2016, they initiated the most ambitious and risky operation in their history. They set their sights on an American company whose reputation was perhaps the only one in the world capable of competing in darkness with IG Farben's Nazi past. They set their sights on Monsanto. Monsanto was not just any company. They were the creators of PCBs, toxic chemicals that contaminated the world's rivers for decades. They were the creators of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant that devastated the jungles of Vietnam and left a legacy of malformations and cancer in thousands of soldiers and civilians. They were the owners of transgenic seeds and the best-selling herbicide on the planet, Roundup, based on a molecule called glyphosate. When Bayer announced it would buy Monsanto for $63 billion, financial analysts called it a strategic consolidation. But environmental defenders and historians called it the marriage of hell. The inventors of Zyklon B gas were joining with the inventors of Agent Orange. It was the definitive merger of European poison with American poison. Despite global protests, the deal closed in June 2018. Bayer, in a desperate attempt to clean the image of its new acquisition, did something unheard of. They eliminated the Monsanto name. The brand disappeared from the face of the earth. But its products, its employees, and, most importantly, its legal debts became part of the Bayer family. The cross of the pharmacy now protected the king of herbicides. But the hell, as Bayer well knew from its long history, always comes back to collect its debts. And Monsanto's debts were much larger than the accountants of Leverkusen had anticipated. Just a few months after the purchase, the sky collapsed on Bayer. A school groundskeeper from California named Dwayne Johnson, who was dying of terminal non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, took the company to trial. Johnson had used Roundup for years in his work and alleged that glyphosate had caused his cancer. Bayer, using the same denial strategy it used with heroin and contaminated blood, mobilized its army of lawyers and scientists on payroll. They presented studies financed by themselves that said the product was as safe as water. They attacked the credibility of independent researchers. But this time, the jury had access to something Bayer could not hide: the Monsanto papers. They were internal emails that demonstrated that the company had known for decades that there were serious doubts about the safety of glyphosate. The documents revealed how the company drafted scientific articles on commission and then paid external scientists to sign them as if they were independent. They revealed how they pressured regulatory agencies to ignore negative data. Dwayne Johnson won. The jury not only awarded him compensation, but imposed a massive punitive fine against Bayer, declaring that the company had acted with malice and oppression. It was the first crack in the glass wall. Behind Johnson came thousands more plaintiffs: farmers, gardeners, parents whose children played on lawns sprayed with the chemical. By the year 2020, Bayer faced more than 125,000 lawsuits in the United States alone. The company that survived the Nuremberg trials was now being financially bled by ordinary citizens in civil courts. Bayer had to reserve $16 billion to try to close these trials. Its shares plummeted. Shareholders, who had previously toasted the purchase of Monsanto, now demanded the heads of executives. But once again, the pharmacy of hell demonstrated its capacity for mutation. They did not immediately withdraw the product. They simply changed labels, moved their assets, and continued selling glyphosate in the rest of the world, especially in developing countries where laws are a distant echo of justice. Epilogue. The pharmacy remains open. If we look at the complete history of Bayer, from that small dye workshop in 1863 to today's biotechnological empire, a terrifyingly consistent pattern emerges. It is not a series of accidents, it is a methodology of existence. Bayer is a company that has perfected the art of externalizing pain. They make money selling the cure, but they often make much more money by first creating the need or ignoring the damage they cause. They sold heroin to cure coughs, and when the world became addicted, they sold other drugs to treat addiction. They sold gas to kill lice, and when the regime asked them for gas to kill people, they simply removed the smell and charged the bill. They sold contaminated blood because it was cheaper than throwing it away. And they bought Monsanto because they wanted to control life itself, despite knowing they were buying a legacy of poison. It is an entity that operates under purely chemical logic. Morality is a contaminant that reduces the efficiency of the economic reaction. The men who run Bayer today are not Nazis, nor are they drug traffickers from the late 19th century. They are elite professionals, but they serve the same power structure. They serve a cross that has become a sword that cuts both ways. Today, Bayer leads the race in genetic editing. They are redesigning the DNA of plants and searching for cures for diseases that today seem impossible. And that is the most disturbing thing of all. The world needs Bayer. We need their medicines, their vaccines, their capacity for innovation. The pharmacy of hell has become indispensable. They have made us dependent on them, just as the patients of 1900 were dependent on their heroin. We have traveled 160 years of shadows. We have seen the children of 1890 taking their heroin syrup before sleeping. We have heard the sound of boots in the Auschwitz factory. We have seen the faces of hemophiliac patients knowingly infected with the AIDS virus. And we have seen crop fields sprayed with substances that sicken the land and the body. Can we forgive Bayer? Defenders of the company will say they have saved billions of lives with aspirin and with their modern antibiotics. They will say we cannot judge a 21st century company for what IG-Farben did in the 40s. But history is not a book that can be closed and thrown in the trash. History lives in the archives, in the scars of survivors, and in the present behavior of corporations. A company that puts profit above human life, again and again, through 3 different centuries, is not making mistakes. It is following its nature. The next time you enter a pharmacy and see that white box with the blue cross, stop for a second. Remember that the relief you seek has been financed by a century of tragedies. Remember that science is a powerful tool, but in the hands of blind greed, it becomes a weapon of mass destruction. The pharmacy of hell remains open. Its lights are bright, its floors are clean, and its employees are friendly. But in the basements of memory, the gas still flows, the heroin is still bottled, and the price of a human life remains, for them, a simple negotiable figure on a quarterly balance sheet. This is the true story of Bayer. Science for a better life, they say. But after what we have seen, the question still hangs in the air. Whose life?